Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Selamat sore, smart people, as we call CFDS audience, whenever you are, wherever you are, sorry. Uh, my name is Hafiz Noor, Research Division at the Center for Digital Society, Universitas Gajah Mada. I think today's topic is very fascinating because we are going to introduce you for those who have joined our session previously on what it's like about digital public infrastructure. We want to delve more, we want to dig more. What can we learn from the aspects of public in digital public infrastructure? And uh, and I think smart people is aware that we are inviting one of brilliant professors, I think, in the field of digital government or digital governance. But before we start, I think I'd like to highlight some key points throughout the session. Q&A session will be delivered after the presentation coming from our distinguished lecturer. And you can, listen carefully of what will be delivered next, and questions are open throughout the comment section below on the YouTube chat or other platforms that you are using. And the best question will be given an e-wallet from the center. So please prepare yourself with your very best question to our presenter. And for the e-certificate, you can download it through the link below, but will be provided after or before our closing remarks. And without further ado, I would like to invite David Eves, Associate Professor in Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, University College London, where I studied there for my master's in 2021 and 2022. David, hi, good morning in London.
Good morning. How are you doing, Hafiz? Thank you for having me.
Thanks for taking the time, for making the time to joining our session online from London, far away from here, but you see the spirit and also the minds there. And it's good for having you, although I haven't been taught by you, David, personally, but we have, from the center, we have sort of like read your research, particularly on digital governance and also specifically on digital public infrastructure, which I think is interesting discourse to be started in Indonesia. There are several key case studies that I believe you have prepared for us, be it globally and also in the context of Indonesia. So smart people, rest assured, you will be contextualized by what it's like about public in digital public infrastructure. I think without further ado, I'd like to give the floor presentation to David. Please, David.
Thank you so much. So for those of you who are watching, if you can, you may want to make me as big as possible on your screen, just because I'm going to be showing my slides over my shoulder. And so it makes it kind of easier for you to see those. So I'm totally thrilled to be here. I've been following work in Indonesia now for 6-7 years, particularly connected to people in the digital service teams that started in Java and then became national, and just really impressed with some of the work that's going on. And I'm keen to learn more and learn from you, so I can't wait for your questions. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about digital public infrastructure. And I want to just talk a little bit about where it is, what's the context around it, why it's arisen, and then talking about like what's happening in Indonesia that I see looks like it, and then what are the opportunities that arise from that. Okay, before I open, I always just have this important caveat I like to make, which is like I really dislike the term digital government, which may be surprising since it's literally in the title that I have. I'm an associate professor of digital government. And the reason I dislike this term is because there isn't really digital government. Like all government now, whether you're interfacing with a public servant or on a website or on your mobile phone, all of those things ultimately are using a computer in the background to deliver the services or collect the taxes or do some element of the work of government is now happening via computers, whether you're interfacing with a human or not. And so we really don't have digital government. We just have government now. And it happens to be that all of that government exists in a digital age. And so we have to start thinking about what is it that we want our governments to look like? What are the capabilities we want them to have? What needs to be public versus what can be private in this world where everything is going to have a digital component to it? What does that look like? So when it comes to digital public infrastructure, which is, I think, one effort to try to begin to tackle this problem, I want to talk about four things. So one is I want to talk about some of the problems that are kind of leading to increased digitization and thinking about digital government. I want to talk about how governments respond to that. I want to talk about like what's the role of the public servants, and then oops, that's a wrong slide that says what Indonesia is doing about it. Okay, so first, the problem. One problem we have is money. So in 2022, according to Gartner, there was about $700 billion spent by national governments on technology. That's worldwide, total spend. It's a lot of money. $700 billion is a lot of money. But if you break that down, you'll notice that actually about 600 billion of that is being spent in North America, Western Europe, China, basically Japan, Australia, New Zealand, what they term as mature Asia. And the rest of the world combined is only spending $80 billion. So if you broke that out, you'd suddenly realize, wow, there's this like huge amount of money being spent, but the overwhelming majority is being spent in what you might broadly consider OECD countries, leaving very little money being spent by the rest of the world. If you broke that down kind of very roughly on a per capita basis, so how much money is being spent by governments per citizen, you basically have $252 being spent per person in these kind of OECD plus China countries, and only $14 being spent per person in the rest of the world. So about 5.5 billion people getting $14 per person spent on them, 2.4 billion people getting $252 per person. Now, if there's two things that are interesting about this. One is, if you thought the solution to all our problems was that we needed to get these people to get this much money spent on them, you'd have to go find $1.4 trillion every year in perpetuity. And that money does not exist for reasons I'm going to get to. But the other interesting thing about this is if you look at how well these governments are performing versus some of the governments that are over here, you're getting better outcomes in some of these kind of countries that are in this kind of blue bubble. So when you think about countries like India, Brazil, even places like Togo, you're getting some pretty interesting outcomes in this bubble over here, and they're only spending 14. So are these people really the model that we want to be modeling ourselves after? I don't think a lot of people in Germany or in Canada, even the United States, look at how their governments interact with them online and say, yes, that's the model. We should all be just like that. Quite the opposite. A lot of frustration, a lot of broken systems, a lot of things not being optimal. So I'm not really sure we have a clear model. So I'm not sure we should be chasing this. Okay. The next thing I'd say is we have a whole bunch of problems that are coming at us. So one is like in Indonesia, you've got deforestation and climate change that you've got to be thinking about. You've got fiscal challenges where there's just limited kind of budgets that can be spent. You've got inclusivity and diversity issues you got to be dealing with. And of course, you want to be ending poverty as quickly as possible. And we're all recovering from the past pandemic. And there's always the risk of a future pandemic. So one of the funny things about the pandemic is it was a real driver, people recognized that we had to be able to do services digitally more effectively. If you're going to tell everybody they have to shelter in place and they can't move around in order to prevent the pandemic from spreading, well, then you need to have ways for public servants to work from home, for citizens to get services from home, and a lot of that's going to be enabled digitally. So Indonesia and many countries are going to have to do more with the resources that you have. There isn't like a new big check that's going to be written that's going to allow us to spend a lot more on digital. You're going to have to be spending to manage climate change. You have to be managing the next pandemic. You have to spend money to pull people out of poverty. So we've got to really be judicious about the resources we have. Okay. So some governments have responded by thinking about an infrastructure approach. And so let me talk about what I think governments look like without an infrastructure lens on how they work. So I have a very simple view of governments. So you can kind of think of them as like, you've got like your ministries, they've got applications that they're running, so like getting a passport, getting a driver's license, signing up for a health benefit, and then there's some sort of database that's remembering previous decisions that government made, and then on top of that, like what was the passport number you had, what was the date that you got it, when does it expire? It has some sort of way of remembering those types of things. And if you kind of look at a lot of governments, you can imagine those governments composed of ministries. There's like a tax department, maybe there's a department of motor vehicle, a department that offers social services. Well, every time you go to use one of those services, whether in person or online, there's a whole bunch of kind of micro activities that the government does that are effectively the same. So they need to authenticate you into that service. They need to determine, like, is David Eves actually David Eves? The next thing they want to do is they want to collect an address from you. So they're like, okay, what's your address? Where do you live? They may want some sort of unique identifier to be able to pinpoint who you are. Then they have a form they want you to fill out to collect all sorts of information about you. And then they're gonna remember all of that information in their own databases that are in that ministry. One challenge with this approach is that it actually has huge amounts of duplication. Now, every single ministry is actually rebuilding these things over and over and over again. It's a huge amount of inefficiency. Not only that, each one's building it in a unique and different way. So when you go to get your healthcare benefits, you're confronted with one website that looks one way. You go get your driver's license, totally different website, totally different colors, different order of questions, different terminology that's being used to collect the exact same information. Very confusing to your citizens. But one advantage it has is that most governments budget by giving money out to ministries to do work. And so you can give the money to a ministry and say, yes, go build all those things. You're accountable, get it done. And that's how treasuries and ministries of finance know how to behave. And so that's how they allocate money. Of course, I want to be clear with you. This problem is actually way worse than I'm drawing it out here. It's not like the tax department does a single thing. Tax department does 20, 30, 40, maybe 100 different services. And very often, each one of those services is built entirely on its own, duplicating the things that are happening in the same department but next door, collecting same information, asking for the same things, creating duplicate databases of addresses, all of this type of stuff happening over and over and over again, a huge amount of duplication and waste. Of course, if you also, this is exactly used on my slide. So if you look in the tax department, each one of these are collecting income tax, sales tax, tariffs. Each one of these often is its own system as well. Yeah, I hope everybody's with me so far. You're beginning to see this simple version of government, but you can see when we were in a paper-based era, this made sense. You had to collect the pieces of paper from everybody, and so then you had to store them, and you couldn't just share the pieces of paper. That would just become ultimately too complicated. But we live in a digital era now. But we've kind of replicated kind of paper-based ways of thinking without thinking about how we could be using things differently in a digital era to become much, much more efficient. So what we really need to be thinking about is what does an interoperable government look like? And one way to see that is to think about looking at your kind of smartphone as an example of how digital era thinking works. So on your smartphone, so I don't know, many of you probably have Android phones. I happen to have an iPhone, so I'm using it as an example, but it's basically the same. You have your kind of core operating system, Android or iOS, on your phone. And one of the magical things about that is that when you have your phone, you get to download all of these different applications and they just magically work. They just magically work with your phone. And one of the reasons that happens is because when you download an application onto your phone, it's accessing various pieces of hardware in the phone, maybe the GPS, the accelerometer, the camera. Every time they do that, they don't have to build a whole new way to interface with that machinery. And they don't have to build the machinery themselves. They get to leverage what already exists in the phone. And the way they do that is there's a bunch of access points that are standardized. Kind of think of them as electrical sockets that these applications can simply plug into, and it gives them access to these these different devices on the phone. So one thing that I really want to make clear here is that even as everything is changing and dynamic, they continue to work well together. So as I kind of mentioned in this previous slide, here you have these like what we call high variable and low variability systems. So high variability means they're changing a lot. Low variability means they're changing very slowly. And if you look on your phone, that's kind of what's happening here too. The smartphone, the apps on your phone, they're getting updated every week. New ones are getting created. There's a very high variability of change on these. Meanwhile, on your phone, you're getting a new phone every 3, 4. I try to get a phone every 5 years. I really try to be ecologically responsible and buy as few as I can. But even there, I'm getting a new phone every 5 years. So these components are updating on this kind of low variability kind of way. But the magic is when you get a new phone, you enter into you register into your iPhone, your Apple account or your Android account, and all of the applications you previously automatically download, and they all work, even with the new hardware. They all just immediately work. It's kind of magic. And the reason is you have this stable interface layer here where these plugs effectively don't change. So even as these things change and these things change, as long as they kind of keep working with this plug, they'll still work together. So you can have lots of evolution and lots of dynamic activity in your system without changing the kind of integrity of the system. Really, really interesting. So what you're really focused on is this interoperability that allows for you to have high variability and low variability components. Now, if you thought about that from a government perspective, I think it gives us a chance to begin to rethink the way that governments work. And so what does kind of an infrastructure view of government work look like? Well, rather than thinking in terms of building these silos, what if we thought in terms of building kind of like an infrastructure approach where, maybe we have some common components that serve as stable interfaces that allow us to have services that we deliver to citizens that are very dynamic and can adjust quickly depending on need and political desires and all that. And maybe some data that we're collecting that adjusts more slowly as we think about what new data we need to collect and how we want to be collecting it. So if you start to think about your government as a smartphone or as a system that has high variability and low variability pieces to it that are always changing, how do we make it so that the system has integrity because it has some common components? So for services here, I'm thinking about like passports, benefits, things like that. But for these common components, this is where the magic is. So you start to think about authentication. Like, how do we authenticate ourselves into every service? And so the Indians have Aadhaar, which is a biometric identity system, kind of like what Dukapil offers, which we'll talk more about. Singapore has SingPass. The Estonians have their EID. Those are ways that citizens can access both public and private services just by using a biometric or a username and password, and it works across all of them. Equally speaking, you might imagine payments as being a critical layer. Governments almost always want to be receiving payments, and they want to be distributing benefits, distributing money directly into people's bank accounts. And so what does the kind of protocol or the stable interface look like that allows people to do that using lots of different private vendors or public options? And in Brazil, they created Pix, which is a protocol that allows the government and anyone to send money to anybody else basically effectively free. And same in India, they have UPI, a protocol that allows anyone to send anyone else money effectively free. And then you start to think about what are the ways by which government can share data across ministries so it doesn't have to keep collecting the same piece of data over and over again, but rather collect it once and then share it wherever it's needed as it's needed. And that's often referred to as a data exchange. And here you can imagine X-Road, which is the Estonian system for doing this, become very popular around the world. But there are other examples that are out there. DigiLocker is not quite a data exchange, but it's kind of an example of what a data exchange could look like in India, where you can have these credentials in your phone because they're pulling the data from different places. So now you imagine your data as a place where the information you're collecting, but what you need to collect doesn't change as often, but you have a single source of truth about different things like car registration numbers, citizens' unique identifiers, addresses, things like that. So now, again, you begin to break your government down into thinking about services, components, and data. Okay, I'm hoping everybody's with me so far. Now, I want to be clear. One of the papers that we talked about in the introduction was what is public and digital public infrastructure? A big question here is, what is the role for government and what's the role for the private sector? One thing you could begin to imagine is this entire world could be entirely privately provisioned. So you could basically be relying on private sector companies to do all your authentication, private companies to manage all payments, and private companies to manage all data exchange. I think the challenge here is threefold. The first is I think these three activities are effectively essential to running a modern day society. This creates a few problems. One is if these things are controlled by foreign controlled companies, there is a risk that they could leave or like depart your country, simply stop offering the services, and then you would like all forms of data, like all forms of value exchange, like being able to pay people, would leave with them. And I think there's a lot of governments that are deeply concerned about that possibility. The second is the business models that might exist to doing these in the private sector may work well in, say, OECD countries, where people like, the cost of doing this is relatively marginal to the total size of the transaction. But in many places, for example, in the payment space, a lot of these systems really bootstrap off of credit registries and credit systems. And what happens when your population doesn't have a credit history or doesn't have sufficient enough money to be offered credit? Well, then these companies aren't actually often as interested in offering services in your country, but you still need to have some sort of digital payment system. And so a public option becomes increasingly important. So sometimes what you really want are these systems that are focused on enhancing economic development as opposed to simply servicing people. And not all companies are really thinking about economic development as a core mission. And that's not profitable to them. And then the third reason is these things might serve as choke points on your economy. So, for example, it's often beneficial in a network system, the margins are very tight and it's a winner take all market. And there's real risk that one player becomes dominant. And once they do, the barriers to entry become high enough and they can simply extract rents and charge more and more and more. And nobody else can enter and compete them. So you don't really have a competitive market, but one person's extracting a lot of money to deliver an essential service. And that kind of rent extraction is competitively not good for your economy because it's putting a tax on the entire economy or on all access to government services. And so thinking about what a public option starts to matter a lot as well. So it is possible that we might have private solutions, and that in some places might prove to be a great option, a great outcome. But I think in many places, particularly in emerging markets, that's not been the case. And so the interest in kind of a public option, so a digital public infrastructure, has become much more compelling. So most interestingly, Indonesia's already on this journey. So one great example is like thinking about kind of a components first approach. So here, Indonesia is starting to build out some of these stable interfaces. And that started back in 2011 with the enrollment of people in the kind of biometric enrollment system that then led to the EKTP authentication, which could work offline and online, but everybody got their cards. And then 2019, we then enabled digital signatures. In 2022, the launch of the digital ID, the kind of IKD, like that's all building off of each other. But the goal of all of these things is to serve as a kind of shared component that makes it much, much easier to deliver services so that you don't have to build authentication into every service in the Indonesian government, and maybe even some private sector services. That's all now taken care of. It's free, it's cheap, it's universal. People don't have to create new usernames and passwords all the time. And it might help us better organize some of the data that we are collecting about people so we can provision it more effectively. And there are already some great examples of that happening. You have private and public services that are starting to leverage this infrastructure. Here are a couple of examples, but there's even more examples. Like this one was really quite compelling to me of showing what are some of like maybe hints at the early benefits of having these kind of digital systems. So BNI, for example, is a more traditional bank. It took them, kind of 3 years to get to 5 million users. And then but in the next 3 years, they got to 15 million users because they're able to use kind of eKYC, so know your customer. By leveraging the digital ID, they basically tripled the speed at which they were onboarding new users. So super interesting. You can see like the reduction in cost in onboarding people and verifying who they are massively increases and makes it easier to onboard them. But that actually kind of pales in comparison to kind of say Wonder, which just from July to September of this year has already gone from 0 to 1.5 million users. So these guys got to 5 in 3 years. They've gotten already 1.5 in just a few months because they're able to authenticate people using their EID. So it really shows you how it can really drop the costs for businesses as well as make government much more efficient. I think these are really exciting examples. The Social Security Administration for Health also has been using these kind of digital systems for authenticating people to enable them to get access to services. And they've got like a total access of kind of almost 2 billion people have used their EID since 2013 to access these services. So a little bit less, like, that kind of works out to kind of like, I think 5 times a year that people are using it. But already you're starting to see like look, if you have to authenticate people and get them to sign in every time they come in and use the service, that made it much, much cheaper and much, much faster for a whole number of people, saving the government money and just making people spend less time in line and waiting to do things. Okay, I do think that this infrastructure is going to change what public servants need to be thinking about, what they need to be doing. So I've already mentioned that Indonesia has been on this technology journey using digital public infrastructure already. But I think to continue the story, it needs to have a public service journey for thinking about what are the skills that future public servants need to have to better leverage this infrastructure to offer better services. And that means by doing more with less. And so that's going to require new skills, new governance, more coordination, a different way of thinking. So many of you who are watching this are familiar with kind of like agile as a kind of technology way of building services more efficiently. And there's real interest in how can we make governments more agile. And I think infrastructure, like public and digital infrastructure, will make that easier, because if you have a whole bunch of shared components you don't need to build and you can just kind of like grab off the shelf and use every time you launch a new service, but then you can iterate and learn. You can spend more money iterating and learning on what your citizens need about the rest of that service. So we make it cheaper and easier for us to do agile-oriented kind of development and policy work on the service delivery side, because we don't have to build everything. Meanwhile, maybe we're doing kind of agile-oriented work, but probably on the shared components, this is actually kind of starting to become more planning-oriented. We know what we have. We got to make it stable. We got to make it good. Just kind of make sure it keeps getting slowly better, incrementally, but over a longer time period. So this actually may be kind of more waterfall or Six Sigma, in that once we have them in place, we're just slowly iterating on making them better, long time horizons. So we never change anything quickly because we don't want to break anything that's connecting to it on top or on bottom. And here on the bottom, on the kind of like the bottom part of where we're building up this data, this also may be kind of more waterfall oriented. So it's not that it's agile everywhere, that we want our governments to kind of be changing and adapting all the time. It's really thinking about how do we get the right methodologies paired with the right activities. Okay, the other big question we need to be thinking about is who's going to be responsible for the different components in this new government and what it looks like. What should the national versus what should the state versus what should the local governments own? What should regulatory bodies be doing? Should nonprofits have a role in operating this? Do we want some state-owned enterprises? Like, this central infrastructure is going to become so important to all 3 levels of government. It's not sure that you want it actually connected to something that is too close to the political side of government. You kind of want it really arm's length so nobody can abuse it. You want it heavily regulated so that privacy, security, access, and inclusion are prioritized, and anything political is distanced from it. And so some places that might be state-owned enterprises, sometimes that might be special vehicles, sometimes it might be new regulatory bodies are going to be needed, but we've got to think about this. Indonesia is already doing some of this work, kind of like thinking about who these new actors are and kind of using agile to adapt. And so like when you have a new service, like how do you make sure that you're getting user feedback from this to improve these infrastructure layers? And even here, like you're starting to see that with like the EID, where we're improving the user interface and getting better branding, and like thinking about remote onboarding. There's also a bunch of work that's been done on kind of usability and accessibility that I think has been really interesting. And more importantly, you're seeing growing adoption as a result. So these are the total accesses per year by citizens using their EID to access to kind of like get a service or kind of get access to a data so the government can better serve them. And you can see like there's this growth and there's this plateau, and then all of a sudden there's more growth as well. And you can see here in 2024, that number looks low, but that's only the first 6 months of the year. So you can see if the second 6 months are as good as the first 6 months, it's going to blow away 2023. You're going to have a much bigger number. So this system is starting to get this kind of takeoff point where you're starting to get more and more people are using it. It's becoming core to a whole bunch of private sector and public sector usage, and hopefully driving down costs and making it easier for those people to do business. The other thing is you do have great talent and people like who know how to think of this. I met with a team from Dukapil the other day. I was very impressed with the work they're doing. My friend Pandu, who's been part of digital service teams, really great thinker. So there's so many people to mentor young people who are thinking about coming into this space and want to work for government and do good things. There's great teams that already exist. I'm happy to connect you with people that I know. But Indonesia has talent, and that is the most important thing, and really, really, really exciting. Final piece, though, is you just to come back to this, you are going to want to get the governance of this, really, really right. I have this slide I always show to kind of close out, where which is called come from a book called The Narrow Corridor. And what you can think about is like what makes countries successful. Well, part of what they need to do is they need to use new technologies, but what you don't want to have is governments have kind of unfettered ability to use those technologies because they might use them to make things more efficient, but they might also make them use them to control and to control people and violate their privacy and violate their rights. So if you think about this chart that I've got in front of me, on one axis here is kind of like state power, like how much power does the state have to use new technologies? And on this other axis here is kind of civil society oversight, or kind of like think of journalists, civil society, the private sector. And if you have too much state power, what ends up happening is the state uses new technologies to kind of control and prevent dissent. And the problem with that is that dissent is also an essential part of the creative process. So if you want to develop new technologies, you have to enable people to dissent and try out new things. But if you don't have a strong enough state, if the state is too weak, it can't regulate disputes and it can't solve public problems. And as a result, the private sector kind of takes over doing those things, but it doesn't have the authority to do it at scale. And so you kind of end up with a little bit of chaotic systems. So really successful societies are those that kind of run this kind of what they call narrow corridor. So they get state power. The state is allowed to take on new powers and use new technologies, but it's prevented from abusing those by being shackled by regulatory bodies, civil societies, other types of players that prevent overreach and abuse. So I like to kind of overlay an axis on this. And so you can imagine a future with digital public infrastructure where maybe we just fail to launch. We don't actually build this out, and the state doesn't have new capabilities to solve modern problems, and the public suffers. But you can also imagine a world where all of this is owned by the private sector, and they get to extract massive rents and overcharge, control the data, and they get to use it to solve private problems and make profits, but we don't get to use it to solve public problems. Inversely, you can imagine a world where the government has exclusive access or overriding or kind of overpowerful access and uses it not to solve public problems, but to control and prevent dissent. And what we need to be thinking about is what is the governance of this new technology, of this new kind of core infrastructure that we need to run modern societies that is going to allow us to solve public problems and prevent overreach and abuse. This is a big project that we have in front of us that we need to be collectively thinking about. And that's something I think it's going to take an enormous number of very committed, creative, and intelligent Indonesians to think about in Indonesia, but also many people around the world to give us the right patterns for thinking about this. You can read more about these and some other DPIs I have using this QR code. I'll try to show this again later, but I just want to thank everybody for inviting me. It's been a real privilege to be here, and I can't wait to hear your questions.
Great. Thanks very much, David, for such a comprehensive presentation this morning. I think there are a lot of intriguing questions coming in, as well as sort of like my thoughts in responding to your presentation. I think I'd like to sort of like summarize what it takes of being digital public infrastructure being adopted in Indonesia. Obviously, data needs to be interoperable. There needs to be a sort of like stable interfaces, and also the combination between sort of like high variability and low variability in applications that you are using to make it interoperable. So it's sort of like engaging with the audience, but also in the internal domain system itself. How do you sort of like scale the ability to, being dynamic using the incoming data inputs? That's only sort of like a insights from your presentation, but I think several questions coming in. I myself would like to ask questions, if I may, and I believe so too. I think this is a sort of like fundamental questions before we are sort of like developing publicness in digital infrastructure, right? Is it possible that effective digital public infrastructure is actually playing sort of like a house of cards where small mistakes trigger big disruptions? And does this infrastructure bring us closer to social justice or increasing social control, particularly by the government?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think the answer is yes to all of the above. Um, so there is a world, I think Indonesia is a particularly interesting example because you have I'm Canadian, and so you have a federated structure. And there's a great question I can see lined up that I can't wait to get to about that. There is a possibility that, I kind of ended the talk about that, there 100% is an opportunity to use this to kind of create centralized systems that assert more control. But there's also a possibility to use these kind of to use centralized systems to create a standard that puts accessibility and inclusion at its core, to pull more people in to the formal sector and to give more people access to benefits, government services, and even the private sector systems like banking and things like that. Both are possible. This is why I really, at the end, try to stress this piece about governance. Getting the governance right is so important, because that is the kind of those are the safeguards that determine, are you creating systems that allow for more surveillance and the infringement of people's rights and the kind of like suppression of dissent, or are you building systems that are prioritizing inclusion and access and trust and safety? And that's part of what we try to tackle in that kind of what is public, is that when something's public, it can allow for that, but it can also allow for negative outcomes. But when something's private, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get more inclusion and access. You might just get more rent extraction and control as well, but from private sector actors. So this is why the governance matters so much about this. And I think one advantage possibly that federated states, I'll get to this, but federated states have both advantages and disadvantages. So one advantage is that it can make it harder to coordinate, but it can also decentralize some of that power. You can create some of these systems in more decentralized ways that might make it harder to have that kind of central control and efforts to try to impede people's ability to dissent. So I love this question. I'm happy to talk more about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's sort of like intriguing response coming from you, because in a developing country, say like Indonesia, where you have a low capacity in your infrastructure, in your governance systems, that can sort of like guarding you from that political economy interventions coming in. You need to have that sort of like formidable structure in order for you to prevent that politicization, particularly in this digital public infrastructure, right? I think.
This is one reason why I think it's really interesting about pushing the management and operations of these things out into their own separate entities that are outside of government. So what we sometimes get referred to as quangos, like quasi-autonomous non-government organizations, where like the government establishes it, but then it's kind of run, or state-owned enterprises. So I don't know about in Indonesia, for example. I don't know about the post office, and these institutions are not themselves free entirely of interference. But you kind of create an entity like a telco or a post office, which becomes kind of a publicly owned, state-owned enterprise that kind of operates sometimes away from the politics a little bit, and just has a very narrow and specific function that it does. Another great example has been statistical agencies, which are often inside government, but independent, and actually have international norms being put on them to behave certain ways. I think they're very interesting as a model for thinking about how we might manage this.
Great. I'm going to stop there and see questions coming in our private chat. I think the first question would be coming from Leonardo from one of the universities in Yogyakarta. Leonardo asks, how is DPI designed to ensure inclusivity for undeserved communities or those in remote areas?
Yeah, Leonardo, I love this question. I actually get quite excited about the doors and possibilities this opens up for those types of communities. So I think one of the big mistakes that people the assumption people make that I think is problematic when people think about digital public infrastructure is they then assume that in order to leverage this infrastructure, one has to be online. And this is actually not the case. When done correctly in the places where I've seen it been done, it actually creates a framework and a system by which to organize public services so they can be done offline, but then synced online at a later date. They also increase your flexibility in the ways that you can deliver them. So take, for example, maybe I'll turn some slides back on here for a second. So I talked a little bit about your EID that you have in Indonesia. Well, you think about like it as a system. Well, I have seen governments where officials will have a phone with, say, like a biometric reader device or something, and they can go into communities where people don't have either the financial means or even the physical means to access the internet. And they'll go out into those communities and they'll actually like have their phone and they'll do transactions with people on the phone in those remote communities. And they'll be like the intermediary between them. So they'll be like, okay, like they'll help them log in. They'll say, what do you want to do? What benefit are you trying to apply for? They'll like actually interface with the phone, do that. So you have what's called like this agent model where you have like an agent who goes out in the community, is doing all this work. And you can then build those services on top of them to work on the phone and work offline. What's even more intriguing, and I think this will vary from country to country, is it's not just the government that might build those services, but the private sector might actually take these kind of shared components and build their own way of accessing government services on their own devices and serve as private sector agents that are going out and delivering public services, either because they've been chartered by the government or the government simply says, we'll pay a fee for anybody who helps someone access a service. And so you have these private sector agents that go out and are actually like delivering services to people. And you see this in Bangladesh and you see this in India. So in Bangladesh, for example, they have this franchise model where storekeepers in remote communities are trained up and have a computer just in their store, and people come in and access government services. And the storekeeper effectively operates either as the internet connection, the kind of quasi public official who can help navigate the forms and navigate the services, or as the person who's literate to even tell them what's going on and like to enter the information on their behalf. So I think done well, this actually creates like new delivery model options, both private and public as options by which to reach more people. And then I think done doubly well, those systems ultimately require an internet connection, but they don't require an internet connection at the point of activity. So you can do this remotely and then come back to a place where you have internet access and reconcile all of the work, all of the kind of processes that you did then. So I think we should be, listen, I want to get to a world where we have access to internet for everybody, but we have to live in a world where that's not going to happen for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so how are we going to serve all those people in remote places or in marginalized communities? I think this opens up new possibilities to do that. So I love this question, Leonardo. I think you're thinking about exactly the right things.
Yeah. I think coming up to that response, this is a very sort of like linked up question to the previous question raised by Leonardo. From Kania, considering Indonesia's decentralized governance and regional diversity, I think I would say regional capacity, how can the government ensure interoperability of different platforms? As you know, EID is managed by our home ministry, right? But we have layers of governments from the first level, which is the central government, and then regional government, which consists of provincial, city, or municipality. But also from other provinces in Indonesia as well. And
Yeah.
how do you see this gap and also decentralized governance when it comes to managing digital public infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a great question again. So again, I mentioned before, I'm Canadian. Canada is composed of 10 provinces and 3 territories, and very strong divisions of powers. This is going to vary from country to country. There is a simplicity that happens when a national government can simply take an action and do things that everybody else can leverage. So in Indonesia's example, the fact that you have a national digital ID coming out of Dukatil that seems to be emerging as maybe the national standard, that should make it like if the provinces and local governments, in my mind, probably should be leveraging that. Now, there's lots of reasons why we should have an open conversation about that, the centralized control that gives the national government. So one concern I would have is what happens when, say, you have the governor of one of the states in Indonesia or provinces in Indonesia does something that the national government doesn't like. What you don't want the president of Indonesia to be able to do is to say, I'm going to cut off access to the digital ID for everybody in that province until the governor changes their mind. And so this is why the governance matters so much. We need to make sure that these types of systems are put in places at our arm's length where no one can engage in that kind of political abuse or kind of reach in and do those types of things with any kind of ease or maybe even at all. Now, there are alternative models. Like you could imagine a system where maybe the national government has a national ID, but each province or state then creates its own unique identifier that it's using internally that's piggybacked on top of that. And if the national government decided to turn off its ID, the provinces would still have their own unique IDs that they could then very quickly spin up and use to provision people within the state or within the province. And so that kind of starting to think about like these models where you can create decentralized systems that you don't have to use, but you have the optionality to use. Now, I think in Canada, for example, you're going to actually have the province's own IDs, not the national government. So it's going to be a much more difficult work of getting the provinces to come together and agree on common protocols and common standards for how what they're hosting can be interchangeable and interoperable with each other. And there, I think the national government may have no role to play or may have a kind of convening role to play. But if they don't have jurisdiction constitutionally to be there, then they probably shouldn't be there. And that just makes the work harder to do, but no less important. And my sense is at the local level, like aside from your really large cities like your Jakarta, local governments, in my experience, are so under-resourced. They're actually usually very excited to be able to leverage these shared components and use them because it drives down the cost of delivering services at the local level. So I do think there's work to be done to figure out what is the governance going to look like. And how are we going to have kind of shared systems that allow data portability, and whether these things should be owned at the national level or at the state or provincial level. And part of that is a policy conversation, and part of that is a technology conversation. Maybe quickly to kind of close out, I get excited by like the options that are in front of us. So one example is kind of a data exchange. So the X-Road system that Estonia has, Estonia is a unitary state, so there's no states or provinces. But they architected the system in such a way that it can be federated. So what you can do is you could have every state or province in Indonesia have its own implementation of X-Road to share the exchange of data just within that state. But then you can federate them together so that then you can exchange data across from state to state or from the state to the national government. But at any point, if it wants to, a regional government could decide it wants to leave that federated approach and not share data anymore. And I think that's like a really great example of how we think about kind of both policy and technology working together to adhere to a governance system that allows for kind of like localized control to varying degrees that may make people feel like the system is more trustworthy. Again, Kenya, I love this question. I think there's like a technology and a governance side to it, and figuring out how to do these right is like core to getting this done well.
Yeah. Great question, Kanya. Moving on to the next questions. There are plenty coming in. So, very good questions. Let me see. Okay, I think this is coming from Marcia first. How can we ensure that the public in digital public infrastructure truly serves everyone rather than deepening existing inequalities or even favoring selected groups of the beneficiaries?
Yeah. So there's no simple answer to this question, because I think this is a challenge you face anytime you're thinking about building a public service. How what are the priorities of the government? Where is it choosing to focus on? This isn't just a problem for digital public infrastructure. It's a problem for any public services being offered in general. My own feeling on this is, um, I often like to think like my sense is one of the challenges to getting digital public infrastructure launched is that it's got to be useful to a large number of people in order to be kind of be politically viable. And there are reasons, there are good reasons to start with those who are least best served, but there's also cautionary reasons why about that as well. Like, so you don't want to launch systems that are simply like experimenting on people who have the least like who are the most marginalized and the most at risk. But you don't want to create systems too that like allow simply the wealthy to have better access and like more efficient services. So I do think it's nice to start with services that are kind of universally needed that allow us to understand what the benefits are across the entire spectrum of people. And but not to start with a service like I'm not sure about the Indonesian context well enough, but I can imagine there's some services like getting a passport. Well, the number of people in Indonesia who are able to use a passport and travel, that like there's a barrier of like wealth, there's a barrier of access. Like not many Indonesians probably don't get to use a passport and can't get a visa to go travel somewhere else. And so if you used it to kind of like make passport access better, it might be wonderful for people. It might be amazing for people to get better passports, but actually, again, is targeting kind of helping a certain group of people and making their lives easier. Conversely, if you just targeted a service that helped only like those who are most at the margins, you run some risks of creating like there are benefits there if it makes their life better, but you run the risk of creating a service that if it has harms, does disproportionate harm to them. So I really like to think about what are these services that benefit everybody. It both compels you to engage in the politics of this and engage and make sure that nobody is being left behind and that everybody's comfortable with the service, but it has the additional benefit of building public support if you do it well.
Yeah. I think the next question somewhat relates to what I have raised earlier regarding the interconnectedness realm of digital infrastructure nowadays, right? With so much dependence on digital infrastructure, are we perhaps building sort of like, small failure could lead to major disruptions? And sort of
Yeah.
how do you ensure or prevent the risks at least?
Yeah, so maybe there's two things here. So actually, maybe just briefly on the previous question. So I do like this question about like not leaving people behind. I just want to also flag something else, which is a failure to invest in digital public infrastructure is not going to prevent the rise of digital private infrastructure. And one of the advantages that private sector infrastructure will have is they get to pick who their users are. So they get to pick who are the most profitable users and simply focus on them. So I do want to make sure that we have public sector institutions that are thinking about how to serve everybody. But I'm also concerned about us getting paralyzed by not finding the perfect way to create public benefits for absolutely everybody and simply not doing anything and leaving the field open for private sector players to emerge that really will only serve a subset of people because it's profitable for them to do that, and they simply don't care about leaving everybody else behind. So that's a simple, maybe just a quick follow-up on the previous question. I think this next question is really compelling, which is what are the risks here of creating kind of like choke points, like and kind of vulnerable points where if they got compromised, it prevents everything from happening because everybody's dependent on like your payment switch, your data exchange. And we've certainly seen this, like the Estonians who built X-Road use that to move like almost all the data around the government, but also like between some private sector actors and government. And back like several years ago, that system was attacked, presumably by the Russians, who kind of did a denial of service attack on it. And it did not collapse, but the system definitely was compromised for a bit, where it was unable to deliver services to certain parts of the system for a little bit period before they were able to kind of get it going again. And so that's why the Estonians have now created this like major cybersecurity hub to think about security, because they want to make sure their system is resilient as possible. I think there's a compelling case to be made to actually, like, maybe you want to have redundancy in these systems. So you can imagine having two data exchange systems that are being run by the government, or two payment switches. There's also a reason to pay on the payment side, like you could have a public option and a private option. So you have something to fall back on if one goes down. Because it's not just the public that could fail, like your private systems could fail too. I don't know the perfect answer to this at the moment. I think particularly like for Indonesia, there's all sorts of places where maybe having redundancy is going to make sense because you're a 300 million person country, so it's pretty big. So as your GDP just continues to increase, the resources you're going to have and the cost per user is going to be very low. I think it's going to be a much more challenging question in smaller countries that are kind of 40 million and fewer, where the cost of maintaining multiple systems may be prohibitive. So excellent question. I don't pretend to have all the answers to it.
Yeah. I think this would be the last question coming in, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so far, yeah, this would be the last question, but let's see how it goes. This one's coming from Anna. What are the challenges of letting a private sector manage or even plays a role in digital public infrastructure in a country like Indonesia? Because Indonesia, she thinks, doesn't have the social, political, or economy guidance, for example, that would allow us to independently manage DPI, or we are lacking of the capacity to do so. What do you suggest?
I don't want to pretend like I know what the right answer for Indonesia will be. And I think the most important thing is that Indonesians have a robust debate and a conversation about what models will work for them. I think there are very compelling reasons for why a public approach to digital infrastructure is going to be a right approach, but there are all sorts of places where it will not be. Either because it's maybe not the cheapest and more efficient, I have more doubts about that, but because it simply is not viable for political or for social reasons. And I think that's okay. The most important thing is that we have a way of thinking about digital infrastructure and recognizing it as kind of central to running modern societies. That is the kind of other piece I would say, though, is like, if you look at the history of the state, it has been the traditional function of the state to issue some form of identification to enable people to assert who they are. So states have almost always historically had some form of identification, whether a civil registry, whether through some sort of ID system, to be able to help people assert who they are, which has been essential to onboard people into the banking sector and all sorts of other things. I don't think that responsibility goes away in a digital era. So on identity, I do think the state is going to end up playing a central role, in part because the state is going to have to trust whatever identity emerges, and and I'm not sure it's going to trust something that's provisioned by Google. The state has also had a traditional function in helping create systems of value exchange. The state runs national banks, it prints currency, it enables people to kind of exchange value. What does that look like in a digital era? That has been to some degree a state function. And many states are going to want to have that system be focused on development, particularly in the global south and global majority, to enable development. And I'm not sure the private sector is as well positioned to do that, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. And then finally, the state is very concerned about competition and effectiveness. And so, like, I do think having private sector players do things in ways that extract rents or create barriers to entry to new players will also be of concern to the states. And so creating kind of state-owned nationalized versions that are driven by low cost and universality and access has real appeal. But I don't know the answer to these questions, and I certainly don't know them for what they should be in Indonesia, because that's a political, it's an economic, and it's a social choice. My only request is that you have that debate.
Okay, great. I think that sums up our Q&A session so far. I thank everyone, smart people, who's involved in the Q&A session, and also thank you for being such a good participant in this morning session and also afternoon session. Dave, Thank you very much for a beautiful presentation and also the answers response coming from our audience. I think I'd like to highlight or sum up what you are presenting today. Uh, I think instead of sorry, from the presentation, in the infrastructural view that is coming from the government needs to be seen not as a physical, development of digital infrastructure, but how do you get these services flexible with the data inflow coming in every time, and how do you make it dynamic and also with such capacities, and how do you sort of like scale your capacity or the aspects of scalability for the public institution for sure. I think I'd like to hear from you if there are any closing remarks, Dave.
No, I so impressed by the quality of the questions and the kind of the thoughtfulness that people are approaching this topic. I think one thing that's interesting about digital public infrastructure is that you should actually please go to the DPI map, dpimap.org, where we've been kind of chronicling digital infrastructure around the world. One thing that's been interesting is actually a lot of it's been around for a long time. There's some going 15 years, 20 years old, but a lot of it is new. I do think this conversation is emerging, and it's going to need people just like you in the audience who are asking smart questions and pushing.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right answer, but it needs this debate, and it makes me excited to see so many people so engaged here.
Yeah, it's always been like that, and we are thankful for such a good, intriguing questions coming in from our audience. I thank you also, smart people, for tuning in for the last 1 hour. Apologize to all smart people if we couldn't answer all the questions due to time constraints, but I greatly appreciate your enthusiasm. I hope that this discussion has given us a deeper understanding of what it means of public or publicness in digital infrastructure. I think this allows us for further discussions on digital public infrastructure moving forward in Indonesia. Dave has presented us several case studies coming from Indonesia, be it from the EID to digital private infrastructure from our state-owned banks. I think that's a very compelling case studies. And before we finish, I'd like to share with you several important information regarding certificates. The link to get the EID certificate can be found on the chat below, and the link to to the claim will only be available for the next 2 hours. So smart people, if you really want to get the e-certificate, please fill out as soon as possible. And we inform you that it requires administrative processing to produce the e-certificate. So please be patient while you are waiting for the e-certificate to be published. Also, would like to remind smart people to stay updated on our Digital Society Week schedule, as this would be the last session for this week. But tune in for next week's session. I think we have several sessions coming in starting from Monday, and the closing would be on Thursday, which highlights or sums up all sessions from day 1 to day 10 of Digital Society Week. Lastly, the best participant of this discussion is Mercia from the public audience. Mercia, thank you once again for such a very good question. For Mercia, please contact our social media for more information on how to claim your prize. Then again, I thank David for airing from London. It's 9:30 a.m. in the morning from London. David, thanks very much for such a beautiful presentation. We are delighted to hear from you. I personally do, because I haven't been taught by you before, and this is the first time I am joining your session and moderating. Such an honor for me. Thanks, David, once again.
Thank you.
I thank you all. I think we can finish and wrap up the session. Thanks very much once again. Thank you for all participants. Thank you, David. See you on the next Digital Society Week session on Monday. Thank you all.